If you remember back in January, I preached a sermon, and I said, who had a New Year's resolution, right? And I had you raise your hand. Jim was back there. He said, I'm going to go to the gym and all these other things. And I was like, okay, we're like 8 days into this. Who has done that? And like fewer hands came up. And so here, right, Wednesday was Ash Wednesday. We started Lent. Who here had a Lenten practice you were going to pick up? Yeah, I'm not going to call you out. Maybe I will. Who has done it faithfully? Good for y'all. Y'all are better than me. We're only 4 days into this. Let's ask the same question next week. But this is the time where, like, I'm going to give up something, right? And then that coffee looks really, certainly this morning, that caffeine looked real good. If you gave up caffeine for Lent, today was hard, right? Or like you gave up meat, right? And then you went to a friend's house who had a cookout. Like, those burgers look real good, right? Or maybe you tried to take on something and you took on additional prayers and you're like, my to-do list. There's always something that gets in the way. There's always some temptation. There's always something else. And then we have today's gospel where, frankly, Jesus makes it look easy. And we've all heard this sermon before, right? I've probably preached this sermon. You face these trials, you face these temptations, you just need to know the Bible verse. Right? You can go to the bookstore and you can find 101 verses to know when you're facing whatever. And it'll have an index and it'll say when life throws you this, you pull up some verse and you read that verse. And that's all you need, right? We've all heard that. We've seen those books at Mardell. Seems like that's what Jesus is doing today, right? Satan comes to Jesus, so we know where we are in the story, right? Jesus grew up. He went out, met his cousin in the wilderness, got baptized, heard this voice from God. This is my son, my beloved, in whom I'm well pleased. And then poof, immediately Jesus is out there in the wilderness for a little over a month. Right? No food, no water, no shelter, no nothing. And Satan comes to him and says, I know you're hungry. I know you gave that thing up, and it looks real tempting, doesn't it? Tell these stones to become bread. Jesus says, nope, I know my Bible. Man does not eat by bread alone. We've heard that sermon. Satan tries another tact and says, hey, just worship me. You can have all the power. You can have all the authority. You can have all the kingdoms. You can have all the everything. Just do this thing for me. Jesus says, nope, I know my Bible. I'm going to quote you this verse. Worship the Lord your God and serve only him. I know it. I can do it. Satan tries another tactic, takes it to the edge of the temple and says, throw yourself down. If you think you're so big and strong and can do it, these angels will lift you up. Jesus said, I know my Bible. I know it. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. I can do it, Jesus says. Here's the secret. Jesus can do it because Jesus is God. We can't just quote the Bible and magically make things go away because we're not God. And so what do? We've heard that sermon. People use Jesus as this example. We just strive to be like it. We just strive to do all these things. And yeah, we should strive, but we can't. So what else is going on here? Is Jesus just saying, do what I do and you're going to be able to master these? Is this like Jesus' 3 steps to overcoming temptation? No. Because Jesus isn't cherry-picking verses. He's not looking up an index and the Satan says, oh, you're hungry? Okay, let me look in this devotional prayers and scripture for when I'm hungry. Okay, there it is. I'm going to read it. Oh, no, it's power and authority. When I'm tempted by power and authority. Nope. That's not what Jesus is doing. What Jesus is doing is remembering a very specific story. Because he's not quoting things from all over the Bible. He's quoting from the beginning of Deuteronomy. All of it comes from the same section of Scripture. And if you don't remember the story of Deuteronomy, this is Moses talking to the people of Israel after they've been in their own wilderness, after they've done their own wandering, after they've faced their own trials and their own temptations, and they wonder, where is God? We're hungry, Moses. We want some power finally, Moses. We want some protection finally, Moses. And Moses reminds them, when you were hungry, did God not provide? When you were enslaved, did not God provide? When you needed protection, did God not provide? Jesus is remembering a story. Jesus is remembering the truth that was handed down to him. When people faced trials and temptations and suffering and wandering in the wilderness, God was there. Not because they did the right things, not because they knew the right verses, not because of anything. They did. God was there because God is always there. And so when Jesus faced this temptation, when Satan said, come and do this, or you know you need this, Jesus didn't just have to say, oh, I'm smart enough. Oh, I can handle it. Jesus didn't have to do that. Jesus could remember the times when God showed up and trust that in that moment, God would show up again. Can we do the same thing? Paul hammers this home a little bit. Again, Paul, we pick up in this weird part of Paul's letter, and it makes the sermon completely different. We've heard this sermon before. Paul says the word, which we all hear the word and we think the Bible. Spoiler, it's not what Paul was talking about. The word is very near to you, on your lips and in your heart. And if you confess with your lips that Jesus raised from the dead and believe in your heart in God, you will be saved. We've all heard that sermon. We have to say magic words. We have to believe the right things. And poof, it's easy. We've heard that sermon. But what's Paul really saying? If we back it up a little bit and don't pick Paul up in the middle of an argument, things fall apart when we try to pick up Scripture in the middle of an argument, right? That leads to some misreadings. Paul's talking to a church that's struggling. Paul's always talking to a church that's struggling. But here, they're figuring out what it means to be. They're waiting for God to come back, right? They're waiting for Jesus to come back. They're waiting to be out from under oppression. They're waiting to be at peace again. They're waiting for all these things. And they're wondering, where is God? They're like, Paul, where is God? And Paul doesn't tell them, oh, you just got to say the right thing or believe the right thing. That's not what Paul's getting at. If we go back just a couple of verses to the beginning of what Paul's talking about, guess what? He's quoting Deuteronomy. He's going back to that same story Jesus went back to. When Moses is there with these people who've been wandering around for years, and they're like, where's God, Moses? We're hungry. We're starving. Our friends are dying. There's no hope. You let us out here to die, Moses. Where's God? Moses reminds. And the part that Paul quotes that we don't read says we don't have to go up to heaven to look for God. We don't have to go on some big journey to find God. Because the Word, God, is near. He's on your lips. He's in your heart. God is with us. That's the point of this whole thing. God is with us. We remembered that at Christmas, and we celebrated that throughout the Epiphany season, and we don't put on purple and magically just forget. We come here, we put veils over the cross, we don't say Alleluia, we pretend for a couple weeks that we don't know how this story ends. Seasons like this are helpful because they remind us again and again that we're going to find ourselves in our own Lent. And we're going to wonder, where is God? Wherever you are, whatever wilderness you find yourself in, or whatever mountaintop you find yourself in, you may wonder, where is God? Do I have to go up to heaven to pull him back down? Do I have to go on some great journey to find him? And even here, in these 7 weeks of Lent, we cannot forget God is near. Whether you're on the mountaintop or in the wilderness, Whether your journey involves pain, grief, and heartache, or joy, hope, and expectation. Whether you think you've got it all together or you know you can never be enough. Whether you're here because you think you're doing the right thing or you're here because you have nowhere else to turn. God is near. God is with us. Even in Lent. Even in the wilderness. You know what I have to say about that? Alleluia.